The Weight of Legacy, a complete Old West story. Chapter 1. The ghost of ownership. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills of Wyoming territory as rancher Tom Bradley rode his horse along the boundary fence of what he had believed to be his newest acquisition. 3 months earlier, he had purchased the 2,000-acre Whitmore spread from the Territorial Bank after the previous owner defaulted on his loans, expanding his already successful cattle operation into one of the largest in the region. What he encountered near the old homestead cabin would force him to question everything he thought he knew about property, justice, and moral obligation. The boy couldn't have been more than 15, thin and weathered beyond his years, sitting on the porch of the dilapidated cabin with a rifle across his knees. His clothes were patched and faded, his dark hair hung over hollow eyes, but there was something in his posture that spoke of determination rather than defeat. "You're trespassing, mister," the boy called out as Tom approached, his young voice steady despite the obvious disadvantage of facing a grown man on horseback. Tom raised his hands peacefully, showing he meant no harm. "Easy there, son. I'm Tom Bradley, and I own this land now. Bought it fair and square from the bank 3 months ago." The boy's grip tightened on his rifle, but he didn't raise it. "You may have bought it, but it don't rightfully belong to you. This was my father's land, and his father's before him. My family's been on this ground for 20 years. Tom dismounted slowly, his experienced eyes taking in the boy's condition and the state of the property. The cabin was in disrepair, the fences were broken, and there were clear signs that the place had been struggling long before the bank foreclosure. "What's your name, son?" "Jonathan Whitmore," the boy replied with quiet pride. "And before you ask, yes, I'm related to the man who lost this place to your bank friends." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. Jonathan Whitmore. He had assumed that old Samuel Whitmore had no living relatives when he died, leaving the property to be seized for unpaid debts. The bank had assured him that there were no complications, no heirs to contest the sale of Jonathan. Tom said carefully, "I was told that Samuel Whitmore died without any family. Are you his son?" The boy's jaw tightened with bitter memory. "Samuel was my uncle. My pa was his brother Marcus, died 2 years ago from pneumonia. Uncle Samuel took me in, tried to keep the ranch going, but the debts were too much, and he got sick too." Tom studied the boy's face, seeing the honesty and pain there. "And when your uncle died, bank men came and said everything had to be sold to pay what was owed. They told me I had no claim on the land, that I was just a minor with no legal standing. Said I should find somewhere else to go, but you stayed." Jonathan's chin lifted. Defiantly, "This is my home. My pa built that barn with his own hands, cleared those fields, dug that well. Uncle Samuel's buried up on the hill next to Pa and Ma. I ain't leaving." Tom felt his conscience wrestling with his business interests. He had paid good money for this land, invested significant capital in expanding his operation to include it. But looking at this boy, clearly surviving on his own through sheer determination, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the situation. "Jonathan, how have you been living? What have you been eating?" The boy gestured toward a small vegetable garden behind the cabin, and some snares visible in the nearby woods. "I hunt, fish, grow what I can. Uncle Samuel taught me to be self-sufficient before he died, and the bank just left you here alone." Jonathan's expression darkened. "They tried to run me off a few times, but I know this land better than anyone. I can hide in places they'd never think to look. Eventually they stopped coming around, figured I'd starve or freeze and take care of their problem for them." Tom looked around the property with new eyes, seeing not just the land he had purchased, but the home that had been torn away from a young man who had already lost everyone he loved. "Jonathan, do you have any papers, anything that might prove your family's ownership of this land? Papers burned in the fire that killed my folks." Jonathan replied bitterly, "Convenient, ain't it? No papers, no proof, no claim. Just the word of an orphan boy against the legal documents of the bank." But as Jonathan spoke, Tom noticed something that made his heart race with possibility. Around the boy's neck hung a small leather pouch, the kind that frontier families often use to keep their most precious documents safe. "What's in the pouch, Jonathan?" The boy's hand moved protectively to the leather bag. "Just some things Pa gave me before he died. Said they were important, but I never could read them proper. Would you let me take a look? I'm not trying to trick you, son, but if there's anything in there that proves your family's claim to this land, it could change everything." Jonathan studied Tom's face for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to trust this stranger who claimed to own his family's home. Finally, with obvious reluctance, he pulled the pouch over his head and handed it to Tom. Inside were several folded papers, yellowed with age but still legible. As Tom examined them, his breath caught in his throat. There was a homestead certificate in Marcus Whitmore's name, a deed showing clear ownership of the land, and most importantly, a will that left everything to Jonathan when he came of age. "Jonathan," Tom said slowly, "these papers prove that your father owned this land legally under the Homestead Act, and according to his will, everything should have passed to you as his heir." The boy's eyes widened with desperate hope. "You mean it? The land really is mine? According to these documents, it should be. But there's a problem." Jonathan's face fell. "What kind of problem?" "Well, I purchased this land legally from the bank, and I've already invested thousands of dollars in improvements and expansion. Even if your claim is valid, untangling this mess legally could take years." The boy's shoulders sagged with defeat. "So it don't matter what those papers say. You got more money and better lawyers than I'll ever have." Tom studied Jonathan's face, seeing not just disappointment, but the kind of resignation that came from a lifetime of adults letting him down. The boy expected to be cheated, expected the powerful to take from the powerless without consequence. "Jonathan," Tom said quietly, "what if I told you there might be another way to handle this?" "What do you mean?" Tom was quiet for a moment, wrestling with a decision that could cost him everything he had worked for. But looking at this brave young man who had lost everything yet refused to give up, Tom knew what he had to do. "What if we went into partnership? You provide the land that's rightfully yours. I provide the capital and experience to make it productive again. We work together to build something that honors your family's legacy, while creating a future for both of us." Jonathan stared at Tom in amazement. "You'd really do that? Share ownership with someone like me?" "Jonathan, you're not someone like you. You're the rightful owner of this land. A young man who's shown incredible courage and integrity. Those are exactly the qualities I want in a business partner." As they shook hands on the agreement, both of them knew they were beginning something that would test not just their business skills, but their character and their commitment to doing what was right even when it was costly. But their moment of hope was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Tom looked up to see a group of riders approaching, led by a man he recognized. With a sinking heart, Banker Morrison, the man who had sold him the property. "Mr. Bradley," Morrison called out as the group reached the cabin. What are you doing here with this trespasser? I thought we had made it clear that he was not welcome on your property." Tom stepped protectively in front of Jonathan, his decision made. "Actually, Mr. Morrison, I think we need to have a serious conversation about exactly whose property this really is. Subscribe to our channel to see what happens next. Will Tom be able to prove Jonathan's rightful ownership? What dark secrets about the bank's land dealings will be exposed? Don't miss the explosive next chapter where justice battles corruption in the Wyoming territory. The confrontation at the Whitmore homestead quickly escalated as Banker Morrison realized that his carefully orchestrated land grab was unraveling. Tom Bradley's unexpected alliance with Jonathan Whitmore threatened to expose years of fraudulent foreclosures and illegal seizures throughout the territory. "Mr. Bradley," Morrison said with forced calm, "I'm afraid this boy has filled your head with lies and fantasies. The bank's foreclosure was completely legal, and this property belongs to you free and clear." Tom held up the documents from Jonathan's leather pouch, his voice steady with controlled anger. "Mr. Morrison, these papers tell a different story. They show that the Whitmore family owned this land legally under the Homestead Act, with no outstanding debts to your bank." Morrison's face paled as he recognized the potential disaster these documents represented. "Those papers are probably forgeries. This boy would say anything to steal land that doesn't belong to him." Jonathan stepped forward, his young voice clear and strong despite facing a group of armed men. Mr. Morrison, you know those papers are real. You saw them when you came to foreclose on Uncle Samuel. You said they didn't matter because I was just a kid. That's a lie." Morrison snapped, but his nervous demeanor betrayed his guilt. Tom studied Morrison's reaction and realized they were dealing with something far worse than a simple foreclosure error. "Mr. Morrison, exactly how many properties has your bank seized from families with questionable documentation?" Before Morrison could answer, another voice cut through the tension. "That's an excellent question, Mr. Bradley." Everyone turned to see a familiar figure approaching on horseback. Judge Harrison, the territorial magistrate known for his integrity and fairness. Behind him rode Sheriff Williams and a man Tom didn't recognize wearing a federal marshal's badge. "Judge Harrison," Tom said with relief, "thank goodness you're here. We've discovered some serious irregularities in the bank's handling of the Whitmore property." Judge Harrison dismounted with the dignity of his office, his experienced eyes taking in the scene before him. "Mr. Bradley, we've been investigating reports of fraudulent foreclosures throughout the region. Your telegram yesterday was exactly the evidence we needed." Morrison tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was beading on his forehead. "Judge, this is a simple property dispute. Nothing more." The federal marshal stepped forward, producing an official document from his coat. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Marshal Davies with the Territorial Land Office. You're under investigation for systematic fraud in land acquisitions." Jonathan moved closer to Tom, clearly overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of so many officials. Tom put a protective hand on the boy's shoulder, silently communicating his support. "Jonathan," Judge Harrison said gently, approaching the young man with paternal kindness, "I understand you have documents that might prove your family's ownership of this land." "Yes, sir," Jonathan replied, offering the papers with hands that trembled slightly from nerves and hope. Judge Harrison examined the documents carefully, his legal expertise immediately recognizing their authenticity. "These are genuine homestead papers, properly filed and recorded. Marshal Davies, this property should never have been available for foreclosure." Marshal Davies turned his attention to Morrison with professional intensity. "Mr. Morrison, can you explain how your bank foreclosed on property that was owned free and clear under federal homestead law?" Morrison's composure was cracking under the pressure. There were debts, unpaid loans, back taxes. "What debts?" Jonathan interrupted with growing confidence. "Pa and Uncle Samuel always paid their bills. They were proud of owning their land outright." Tom pulled out a notebook where he had been recording details of the case. "Mr. Morrison, I'd like to see the documentation of these alleged debts, loan applications, payment records, tax assessments." The banker's silence was telling. After several moments, he finally spoke with obvious desperation. "Some records may have been lost in a fire at the bank. How convenient." Marshal Davies said dryly, "Mr. Morrison, we've been investigating similar claims throughout the territory. The pattern is always the same. Families lose their documentation. In accidents or fires, the bank claims unpaid debts, and the property is seized and sold." Sheriff Williams, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, stepped forward with his own revelation. "Judge, I've been keeping records of all the foreclosures in my jurisdiction. In the past 2 years, Morrison's bank has seized 14 properties, all from families who claimed the debts were fictitious." Tom felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "Sheriff, were most of these properties later sold to wealthy buyers from outside the territory?" "Every single one," Williams confirmed. "And Morrison always seemed to have buyers lined up before the foreclosures were even finalized." Jonathan looked up at Tom with new understanding. "They were stealing land from families and selling it for profit. That's exactly what they were doing, son," Tom replied grimly. "And if we hadn't found your papers, they would have gotten away with stealing your inheritance too." Judge Harrison's expression had grown increasingly severe as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "Mr. Morrison, you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy, and theft of property. Sheriff Williams, please take him into custody." As Morrison was led away in handcuffs, still protesting his innocence, Tom turned his attention to the most important matter, Jonathan's future. "Jonathan," He said gently, "This land belongs to you legally and morally. But the question remains, what do you want to do with it?" The boy looked around at the property his family had worked so hard to build and maintain, his young face showing wisdom beyond his years. "Mr. Bradley, I meant what I said about partnership. I've got the land, but you've got the knowledge and resources to make it productive again." Judge Harrison smiled approvingly at the arrangement. "That sounds like an excellent solution. Mr. Bradley, are you prepared to enter into a legal partnership with young Mr. Whitmore?" "More than that," Tom replied, making a decision that surprised even himself. "I'd like to propose something else, Jonathan. How would you feel about me becoming your legal guardian? You'd keep ownership of your family's land, but you'd have someone to help guide you until you're old enough to manage everything independently." Jonathan's eyes filled with tears of gratitude and relief. "You'd really do that? Take responsibility, Ty, for someone like me?" "Jonathan," Tom said firmly, "you're not someone like anybody. You're a courageous young man who's already proven he has more integrity than most adults I know. I'd be honored to be your guardian and partner." Marshall Davies observed the handshake that formalized their agreement with satisfaction. "Gentlemen, what you're doing here is exactly what this territory needs. Honest people working together to build something good from the ashes of corruption." Over the following days, as the legal paperwork was completed and Morrison's criminal trial began, Tom and Jonathan worked together to assess the property and plan for its restoration. What they found was a ranch that, with proper investment and management, could become one of the finest operations in Wyoming territory. "Tom," Jonathan said one evening as they sat on the rebuilt porch of the cabin, where his family had once lived, "I want you to know how grateful I am, not just for saving the land, but for treating me like I mattered." Tom smiled at the boy who had already begun to feel like the son he'd never had. "Jonathan, you do matter. Your family's legacy matters, and together, we're going to build something that would make your father and uncle proud. What kind of future do you think we can build here?" Tom looked out over the rolling hills that would soon be home to their combined herds, envisioning the prosperity and purpose they could create. "Together, I think we can build the kind of place where hard work is rewarded, where honesty is valued, and where young people like you can learn that the world isn't just about taking from others, but about building something lasting and good." Subscribe to our channel to see the heartwarming conclusion. How will Tom and Jonathan's partnership flourish? What challenges will they face as they rebuild the ranch together? Don't miss the final chapter that shows how justice and compassion can triumph over greed and corruption. 5 years had passed since that autumn morning, when Tom Bradley had discovered 15-year-old Jonathan Whitmore defending his father's land, with nothing but courage and a worn rifle. The transformation in both their lives and the land itself had been remarkable. The Whitmore-Bradley Ranch had become one of the most successful and respected operations in Wyoming territory, known not just for its quality cattle and horses, but for the integrity and fairness with which it was managed. Jonathan, now 20, had grown into a confident young man, whose education included not only the practical skills of ranching, but also business management, law, and the values that would guide him as a leader in his community. More importantly, he had learned that family could be built through choice and commitment just as surely as through blood. "Tom," Jonathan called out one bright spring morning as he rode up to the ranch house, his face glowing with excitement. The letter from the Cattlemen's Association came in. Tom emerged from his office, where he had been reviewing plans for their latest expansion. "Good news, I hope." "The best," Jonathan replied, dismounting and waving the official document. "They've accepted our proposal to host the Territorial Cattle Show next year. The Whitmore-Bradley Ranch will be the center of attention for ranchers from across the West." Tom felt his chest swell with pride, not just at their business success, but at seeing Jonathan's natural leadership abilities flourishing. "Jonathan, do you realize what this means? This ranch that your father and uncle built, that we've restored together, will be showcasing the best practices in the territory. It means Pa's legacy lives on," Jonathan said with deep satisfaction. "Every time someone learns better ranching methods here, every time a young person gets their start in our apprentice program, it's like Pa's work continues to matter." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar carriage, Judge Harrison, now retired but still serving as their legal advisor and friend. Accompanied by a well-dressed woman Tom didn't immediately recognize, Judge Harrison. Tom called out in greeting, "Always good to see you. What brings you out our way?" The judge dismounted with the careful movements of advanced age, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction. "Tom, Jonathan, I'd like you to meet Sarah Mitchell from the Territorial Historical Society. She has a proposal that I think will interest you both." Sarah Mitchell was a woman in her 40s with the intelligent eyes and confident bearing of someone accustomed to dealing with important matters. "Gentlemen, I've been researching the history of land fraud in Wyoming Territory, and your case has become a cornerstone of my work." "How so?" Jonathan asked with curiosity. "Your successful challenge to the Morrison banking conspiracy exposed a pattern of corruption that affected dozens of families throughout the region. The legal precedents established in your case have helped other families recover their stolen land." Tom nodded thoughtfully. "We've heard from several families who were able to get their property back using similar arguments to ours." "Exactly," Sarah continued, "and that's why the Historical Society wants to designate this ranch as an official territorial landmark. The Whitmore Bradley Ranch would become a symbol of how honest people can stand up to corruption and build something lasting and good." Jonathan looked around at the property his family had carved from the wilderness, now thriving under their joint management. "Ms. Mitchell, we're honored by the proposal, but what would this designation mean practically?" "It would mean official recognition that this land represents more than just a successful ranch," she explained. "It represents the triumph of integrity over greed, of community values over corporate exploitation. Future generations would learn about your family's struggle and your partnership as an example of how the West was really won." Tom smiled at the appropriateness of the recognition. "Jonathan, what do you think? Your father and uncle would be proud to know their land had such significance." "I think Pa would say that the most important thing isn't the recognition, but making sure we keep living up to the values that got us here." Jonathan replied with the wisdom Tom had come to expect from him. Their ceremony was planned for the following month, but the celebration was interrupted by news that brought both concern and opportunity. A telegram arrived announcing that banker Morrison, who had served 3 years in territorial prison, was being released and had made threats about reclaiming what was stolen from him. "Tom," Jonathan said as they read the telegram, "you know, he can't actually do anything legally, right? All the court cases were settled years ago." "Legal and practical are two different things," Tom replied grimly. "Morrison lost everything when his corruption was exposed. Men like that sometimes become dangerous when they have nothing left to lose." But Jonathan had grown far beyond the frightened boy who had once hidden on his own land. "Then we'll face whatever comes, just like we always have, together." The confrontation they expected came the very next day. Morrison arrived at the ranch with 2 rough-looking men, his once prosperous appearance now shabby and desperate. "Whitmore," Morrison called out as he rode up to the ranch house, "I've come to discuss a business proposition." Tom and Jonathan emerged together, presenting a united front that demonstrated how much their partnership had strengthened both of them. "Morrison," Tom replied calmly, "you're trespassing on private property. State your business and move on." Morrison's face was flushed with anger and desperation. "My business is with the boy. I'm prepared to offer him good money for this land, more than it's really worth." Jonathan stepped forward with the confidence of a man who knew his worth and his rights. "Mr. Morrison, this land isn't for sale at any price. It's my family's legacy, and it's staying in the family." "Family," Morrison sneered. "You mean this carpetbagger who stole what should have been mine?" "I mean," Jonathan replied with quiet dignity, "the man who chose to do what was right instead of what was profitable. The man who became my father when I needed one most." Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion at Jonathan's words. Over the years, their partnership had indeed become a true father-son relationship, built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love. Morrison's desperation boiled over into rage. "You think you've won, boy? You think your pretty little ranch makes you safe? There are ways to deal with people who steal what belongs to others." But before Morrison could make any more specific threats, Sheriff Williams appeared with 2 deputies, having been alerted by neighbors who had seen the former banker's rival. "Morrison," Sheriff Williams said with authority, "you're violating the terms of your parole by threatening these men. You need to leave this county immediately, or you'll find yourself back in prison." As Morrison was escorted away, still muttering threats and curses, Tom put his arm around Jonathan's shoulders in a gesture that had become natural over the years. "You handled that well, son," Tom said with pride. "Your father would have been proud of how you stood up to him. I had good teachers." Jonathan replied with a smile. "Both my birth father and my chosen father." The official designation ceremony took place a month later, with ranchers, territorial officials, and community leaders from across Wyoming coming to celebrate the Whitmore Bradley Ranch's recognition as a historical landmark. But for Tom and Jonathan, the most meaningful part of the day was the private moment they shared at the graves of Marcus and Samuel Whitmore. "Pa, Uncle Samuel," Jonathan said quietly, placing fresh wildflowers on their graves, "I want you to know that your land is safe. It's prosperous, and it's helping other young people learn that honest work and good values still matter in this world." Tom stood beside him, thinking about the remarkable journey that had brought them all together. "Jonathan, I believe they know, and I believe they're proud of what you've accomplished." "What we've accomplished," Jonathan corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this alone." Years later, the Whitmore Bradley Ranch would be remembered not just for its role in exposing territorial corruption, but for its innovative ranching methods, its educational programs for young people, and its example of how different kinds of families could work together to build something lasting and meaningful. Jonathan would eventually marry, have children of his own, and pass down both the land and the values to the next generation. But he never forgot the lesson he learned that day, when Tom Bradley could have simply claimed ownership and walked away. That true ownership isn't about legal documents or financial power, but about the responsibility to protect and nurture what has been entrusted to your care. The boy who had once stood alone defending his father's land with nothing but courage had grown into a man who understood that the greatest inheritance isn't property, but principles, and that the strongest foundations are built not on legal claims, but on the choice to do what's right even when it costs everything. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories from the American frontier. This incredible tale of Jonathan and Tom proves that true ownership comes not from buying or taking, but from the willingness to protect and nurture what matters most. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join us for more emotional journeys that show how integrity and compassion can triumph over greed and corruption. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that family is built through choice and commitment, and that the greatest legacy we can leave is the example of doing what's right.